This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this closing episode of the USEA podcast series on utility planning practices, we're going to talk about the just emerging understanding of the value of integrating electricity and natural gas resources in power sector planning. Regulatory Assistance Project Senior Associate Mark LeBel is going to describe the key findings in a new paper by the Department of Energy's Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory called Opportunities for Integrating Electric and Gas Planning. Mark's been with the Regulatory Assistance Project, or RAP, a U.S. and global provider of expert guidance on the intricacies of power sector regulations and policy for 6 years. Before joining RAP, Mark worked on energy sector regulatory and policy issues with Acadia Center and the Connecticut Fund for the Environment. So, Mark, let's start here. What features are shared by natural gas system and electric system planning? And how does integrating them take advantage of those shared features in procurements and other utility programs?
Um, Thank you so much for having me again, Herman. This is always a fun time. We gave
Mm.
ourselves, I think, a challenging assignment in this paper. We wanted to look across the country at state jurisdictional primary public utility commission, but also there's also relevance for municipal utilities, co-ops, other types of utilities, to look across the different types of planning proceedings and to think pretty broadly about what the benefits of integration across electric and gas planning might be and what that should look like in the long term, and a few thoughts about how that could start to get done in the next few years.
Mm.
Now, there's a number of reasons why that's a challenge. There are many different regulatory constructs across the country. You know, the big ones
50
are
states.
obvious. Some of the states still have vertically integrated utilities that own generation. Many of them do not. There's all sorts of different subcategories on different issues.
Yeah, there's 50 states, and electric co-ops have different jurisdictional demands than the state they're in.
And there's 40 years of history on these planning topics. So to look
Right.
broadly at planning requirements for both electric and gas utilities, and to think about not the specifics and nitty-gritty of how they work in each state, but to pull up a few broad themes out about how they work in general, and what a long-term vision for integrating gas and electric utility planning might be. That was the challenge we gave ourselves. We did not address a separate set of challenges that is around gas planning for the purposes of electric liability. Much more of that discussion is federal, particularly because electric reliability for a bulk system is federal in many places, and a lot of gas transmission stuff is also under federal jurisdiction. So we focused on a separate set of more distribution level issues that are clearly under our state jurisdiction, but do have these broader linkages to higher level electric bulk system planning. Now, if you look across all these different types of planning, in our judgment at least, we did think there's a few key things you can pull out of the advancements made in planning requirements across the last 15, 20, or 30 years. Um, you know, Improving forecasting and system modeling is a theme across electric system planning, electric distribution planning, and gas planning. Disclosure of system needs and value. Improved solution acquisition practices. That's sort of a generic term that covers anything from big power plants to local distribution resources. Support for innovation you see in many jurisdictions. And then new practices for stakeholder participation, meaningful and equitable stakeholder participation, ideally. And not no one jurisdiction has perfected any one of these. These have all evolved a little bit differently, but and we did benefit from some inspiration from a Grid Lab report on electric planning from a few years ago. But pulling out those threads from all these different planning proceedings, I think was an important step in our thought process of the bigger picture here about what are the key things that states have been working on in this area, and it's part of our thought making process on where the linkages are across these different
Mm,
types of proceedings.
mm. I want to clarify one thing before we go on. This isn't just about utilities that serve both gas and electric customers, is it? I mean, it's for even for larger jurisdictions that, in a more broad sense, have electricity and natural gas resources. Is that correct? Or correct me if I'm wrong.
So right, we put a map in the paper that talks about a few different situations, because there are some places where there's what's called a dual fuel utility, where there's an electric utility that has a defined service territory. And for much, or if not all of this service territory, it's also the gas utility. And that is a simpler situation in many respects, particularly if the gas and electric sides are operated in a closely connected manner. There's some utilities where customers get their gas and electric bills at the exact same time on the exact same piece of paper or electronic
Like Pacific
invoice,
Gas and
right?
Electric or San Diego Gas and Electric,
Right.
something like that.
And that's not common across the country, but that does provide a simplified set of questions. It is a more difficult challenge if you have a separate gas and electric utility that are operated totally independently. In some cases, they may have co-ownership, but may not be integrated at all together in any sense. It
Mm,
could be they could have both two different CEOs, and they could have common shareholders, right?
mm,
Um, you know, but there's also a bunch of situations where it's just two totally different companies that own a gas utility, and the electric service in that area covered by that gas utility is just a totally different entity. And when
mm.
you're dealing with two different entities with no common ownership at all, it just presents a very different set of questions. Um, and our job in this paper was not to get into individual states' statutory authority, but there's going to be some different questions in that context about what commissions can or can't do in the short term with their existing jurisdiction.
But there are, I guess, advantages to combining the planning for both resources. Now, so how can planners collaborate on forecasting and modeling to integrate natural gas and electric system planning? And like, let's talk about one advantage. If they do that, could it improve their ability, for instance, to address large scale, large jurisdictional broad factors like the current remarkable spike we're facing in demand for electricity?
So we think there can and should be a range of benefits from this. Um, at the highest level, more information is always good, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
there are, and not to be utopian or idealistic about it, but there are practical questions about how to efficiently and fairly use new information and make it available at the right time and in the right way. So, we can get to some of those hard practical questions later, but if you can do a better, more comprehensive analysis, um, there's a whole range of improvements that you can start to see. And we talk about some specific ones in the paper, but I think that in general, um, as you start to implement this, you will see a lot more value streams that become clear as a practical matter. But I'll give one example that links to the load growth question that you just raised. So, while there's a number of uncertainties with energy policy in this country in the year 2025, there's still going to be jurisdictions and there's still going to be customers that are pursuing customer heating electrification. And
Right.
to the extent those customers are switching from gas to electric, um, knowing something about their current gas consumption may give you important information about what kind of electric load you'll see during those conversions. So, so this is perhaps an overly simplistic example, but there's actually an interesting academic study that we cite in the paper that looked at very detailed, I think it was actually Pacific gas and electric data, and did some very interesting number crunching about what that means for electric side forecasts and what you can learn from incorporation of that gas data. But I think
Ah,
there's going to be some other value streams as well, and I think it goes to just the practical points about when are you building out infrastructure and when, where are new customers located, if there's choices between different sites and different ways to build out the system. And there are states that are also exploring the possibility of retiring certain gas segments. And if you're going to do that, and you want to electrify those customers, you need to know whether there is sufficient room on the electric system to do that, or whether
hmm.
you need to think about the efficiency of that electrification, or whether you should look at options for those customers besides electrification,
Okay,
including thermal energy networks, but also potentially propane.
so let me extend that because that's really interesting. I mean, you start getting into um, ways to operate your utility or your utilities more cost effectively and efficiently. The paper, I think, describes something called a unified analytical structure. Those are the words used. That could be named anything. Um, with this unified analytical structure that includes both natural gas and electric resources into system planning, it seems like you're creating the baseline or the foundation for addressing the thing that's on everybody's mind these days, which is lowering utility customers' bills. Am I right? Is that where we're going? Is that where you were going, in fact, with what you were describing, building fewer power plants here or fewer power plants altogether? Am I getting that right, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the overall principle is that if you have better information, you can make more efficient decisions, and you can think about specific ways that will play out. But the goal is absolutely to have lower overall electric and gas bills, to make more intelligent decisions about the investments you make, and in many ways you want to be, I mean, and lower customer costs across their electric and gas bills, right? I could go on about some of the other potential benefits that we identify, um, that I think are interesting too, because you may be able to improve reliability if you have better forecasts and you avoid surprise, because reliability gets pinched when you have surprises that you can't plan for and
Uh,
make investments for, right?
uh,
So if you can avoid surprises with better information, better forecasting, and better modeling, then that's sort of the pinch point that you can potentially avoid by having a more integrated process.
so theoretically, somebody could be thinking about building a new natural gas plant, but they would say, but wait a minute, we could get solar electricity to serve some of that load in the middle of the day, and maybe that wouldn't eliminate the necessity for that gas plant, and that would then translate to lower cost for customers. Is in simple terms, am I getting or am I oversimplifying? Please let me.
Well, so look, it's a little bit funny to come up with integration examples that are perfectly on point, because I think that example is primarily an electric sector one. Because you want
Mm,
because and states can and should continue to work on their electric planning and procurement processes to make efficient decisions, and they should work on their gas planning processes to make efficient decisions. But coming up
right.
with ways to integrate them intelligently over time provides somewhat different and um, are the typical examples that come to us tend to be on one side or the other. But to come up with good examples that go across them, um, is a little bit less familiar to us, I think, in the lingo and what immediately comes to mind.
So that's why you're calling for a careful understanding of this unified analytical structure so that you can really get this right. But you've touched on states a number of times. We've touched on states commission planning. These proceedings, they tend to be complex and time consuming enough, and you've been in a lot of them. Um, does does doing this integrated natural gas and electric system planning add to the complexity, or could it potentially streamline the proceedings? And how are commissioners reacting? Have they begun to understand and be open to this potentially big change in planning proceedings because they see advantages in it?
So I think we're at the very beginning of this process, and it's both a blessing and a curse to try to tackle a subject before any jurisdiction has really dug into it. And we don't mind leading the way, and we're happy to have a vigorous discussion about, if people disagree with us or think there's better ideas out there. I think that's part of the process. But there are a few states that are looking at this in different ways. I mean, on the administrative process point, it is. Important to think about that rigorously because the point is not to bury the utilities in paperwork or
Yeah.
to bury commissioners or staff or stakeholders in pointless new meetings. Um, you have to look intelligently at implementing it in a practical way. I mean, I think one good example is forecasting. Um, because it is true that you could take forecasting and technology inputs on a proceeding by proceeding basis and just keep litigating them over and over again. And some jurisdictions have different numbers of utilities and whatever. We could pick a worst case scenario. But the alternative that we suggest is like, look, everyone come to the table once. Let's figure out what the common issues are across all these different planning proceedings. We're not going to necessarily dictate them in this one location, but we're going to figure some of them out. And to the extent that we need statewide assumptions and statewide parameters and certain guardrails, then it makes it a lot easier to implement them in different places, right? So instead of litigating them 17 times, you have
Right.
one place. So you do want to look for opportunities to streamline. And it's not that there can be some additional filings, right? The point is we think there are real benefits from improving the planning process that justifies some new requirements. But look, you should be conscious of not going overboard, making this workable, figuring out when the different filing deadlines are for the different utilities, making intelligent decisions about what workloads might look like, both for the utilities and the commission, and thinking is there a stakeholder friendlier way to manage all of these different planning proceedings? Because if you have
Yeah.
electric and gas separate, and you just assume different people are coming to them and you just schedule them whenever, um, it is going to make it difficult in the future. But if you come up with some ways to integrate all that stuff together, to do common education, to do common stakeholder support and other, including financial, to weave some of those strands together, you should be able to save people a certain amount of time, energy, and stress. So that is an important thing to build into your planning for the process, particularly as we think this is going to play out over a number of years. I don't think anybody's going to put a massive new process in place in 2025. So,
Right. Well, I've said many, many times we're in an energy transition. There's going to be times when it slows down. There's going to be times when it accelerates. There's going to be times when it seems very clear. There's going to be times when it seems completely unclear. But we are in this transition. It's not a left turn. It's a transition. It's a process. And this could be a real important addition to that. But we're out of time, Mark. I think we've covered the basics of this new concept really well, thanks to your input. I want to thank my guest, Regulatory Assistance Project Senior Associate Mark LeBel, for insights into the just emerging understanding of the value in integrating electricity and natural gas resources in planning. As always, I also want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.